Do you ever think about those lost winter meals that kept Black families alive when the cold and the struggle hit at once? These winter meals mattered because they turned almost nothing into warmth and steady survival. What did those pots carry that we're only now beginning to understand? Neckbone stew was the kind of meal that held an entire household together when the cold crept in and the money ran out faster than anyone wanted to admit. Neck bones were cheap, sometimes only a few cents, but they carried enough flavor to build a whole pot of warmth around them. If you knew what you were doing, mothers and grandmothers would rinse them clean, drop them into a big pot of water, and let them simmer for hours until the kitchen filled with a slow, steady steam that made the windows fog up. Onions, celery, salt, pepper, and maybe a bay leaf. If the house had one left, all of it went in to stretch the bones into something that tasted rich and full. Even though the ingredients were simple, kids would hover near the stove, claiming they were cold, but really just waiting for that moment when the meat softened enough to fall from the bone with no effort. Rice or potatoes always went on the side because that was how you made a meal last. And nobody ever complained because the stew soaked into everything it touched. It was not fancy and it did not pretend to be, but it kept bellies warm during winters that felt too long and too hard. Neck bone stew tasted like survival, like patience, like the kind of care that did not need big speeches. It was a winter meal that carried whole families through nights when the house felt drafty and the bills piled high, and even today people remember it with a quiet kind of gratitude. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the kind of dish that proved you could take almost nothing and turn it into something that fed a whole house without anyone feeling shortchanged. Cabbage was cheap, one of the cheapest vegetables in the store, and it filled a pot in a way almost nothing else could. Mothers would slice it thin, toss it into a skillet with a little oil, and stretch one single sausage link so far that every person at the table swore they got a piece. The smell of cabbage hitting the pan was unmistakable, sharp at first, but softening as it cooked down into something sweet and cozy. The sausage added just enough smoke to trick the mind into thinking the meal was richer than it really was. Kids would hover, waiting for the moment when the cabbage wilted just enough to match the shine of the sausage pieces. It was simple, hearty, and warm, and it filled bowls in a way that lasted through the night. In the winter, when money was tight and the weather felt unfriendly, this skillet kept people going. It tasted like thrift turned into comfort, like a mother's hands doing quiet miracles with whatever she had. It was everyday food that remembered its purpose well. White beans with fatback were the slow-cooked winter miracle that kept Black families fed long before money ever showed up in the house. A small piece of fatback was enough to transform a plain pot of beans into something thick, smoky, and full of the kind of flavor that made you close your eyes for a second. Beans were cheap and dependable, stretching across multiple days when they needed to, which was most winters in the 1970s. Mothers would rinse the beans, pick out the broken ones, and drop them into a heavy pot with water, onions, and that precious slab of pork that melted down as the hours passed. The kitchen would smell warm and familiar, like hope simmering even when the world outside felt harsh. Kids knew beans meant full bellies, and they were thankful for that, even if they did not always say it. Served over rice or with cornbread, the beans thickened as they cooled, becoming even better the next day. Fatback was cheap, but its flavor made the whole meal feel bigger and deeper. This was the kind of food that did not just feed you once. It lingered, warmed, and strengthened. It tasted like survival learned across generations. Cornbread and potlikker was a winter lifeline, the kind of dish that carried a deeper history than most people realized. Potlikker was the broth left behind after cooking greens, and in many families it was considered just as valuable as the greens themselves. Thick, salty, and full of nutrients, it became a meal all on its own when paired with a slice of fresh cornbread. Mothers would crumble the cornbread into the potlikker or pour the broth directly over the bowl, letting it soak until the edges softened. Kids loved it more than they ever admitted, especially on nights when the cold felt sharp and the house needed something warming. It was simple food, but it tasted like something older. something that came from the days when nothing was wasted because nothing could be Potlikker filled you up in a way that made your whole body feel steadier. Cornbread gave it something to cling to, turning a thin broth into a full meal. It was winter resilience in a bowl, humble but powerful. No matter how tight groceries got, this dish always came through. Grits with red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast that wrapped around you like a blanket before you stepped into the cold. Grits were cheap, easy, and filling, the kind of food that could keep a child warm through a long school day when the walk to the bus stop felt like a challenge. The red-eye gravy, made from pan drippings and a splash of strong coffee, added a flavor that was sharp and comforting all at once. Mothers made it quickly, stirring the grits until they were smooth and spooning the gravy over the top with practiced hands. The smell alone could coax a sleepy child out of bed. Kids loved how the gravy soaked into the grits, giving each spoonful a deep, savory taste. It was not fancy, and it certainly was not pretty, but it did what it needed to do. It kept families fueled when winter stretched long and money stretched thin. It tasted like early mornings, like care offered quietly, like the start of a day built on strength. Chicken backs and rice were one of the most practical winter meals mothers relied on when the prices of better cuts climbed too high to touch. Chicken backs were cheap, sometimes the only poultry a family could afford, but they carried enough meat and flavor to build an entire pot around. Mothers simmered them with onions and seasoning until the bones loosened and the broth turned golden. Then came the rice, poured in generously because rice made everything stretch. Kids would watch the pot grow fuller and fuller as the grains absorbed the broth. The chicken pieces were small, but the flavor was big enough to make the whole meal feel complete. It was warm, filling, and steady, the kind of dish that felt like a blessing when the weather outside refused to let up. Chicken backs and rice were proof that a mother could take almost nothing and turn it into enough. It was winter courage served in a bowl. Collard greens with hog jowl were one of the most reliable winter foods Black families turned to when the cold settled deep and the fridge looked emptier than anyone wanted to admit. Hog jowl was cheap, far cheaper than most other cuts, but it added a smoky richness that turned greens into something powerful. The pot simmered for hours, filling the house with a slow, rising warmth that made you forget how cold it was outside. Kids grew up on this smell, associating it with safety, hunger, and comfort all at once. The greens softened as they cooked, soaking up every bit of flavor the hog jowl released. Served with rice or cornbread, they became a full winter meal that did not need anything else. It tasted like tradition, like resourcefulness, like the kind of food made by people who knew how to survive anything. Collard greens with hog jowl were not just nourishment. They were a lesson passed down one pot at a time. Black-eyed pea soup was the kind of dish that filled the house for days, getting thicker and richer each time it was reheated. Peas were cheap, long-lasting, and dependable, making them perfect for winters when groceries had to stretch far beyond their limits. Mothers simmered them with onions, leftover bones, and simple seasoning, letting the pot bubble low and slow. The smell was earthy and familiar, the kind that drifted through the rooms and made the whole house feel warmer. Kids did not always know what went into it, but they knew it kept them full when the wind outside made the walls creak. By the second or third day, the soup had settled into a thick, hearty stew that hugged the stomach served with cornbread or rice. It carried families through weeks when money was gone, but determination remained. Black-eyed pea soup was survival food, hope food, winter food. It was a pot that never stopped giving. Cracklin' cornbread was one of the most satisfying winter dishes you could make with almost nothing. Leftover pork cracklin' gave the cornbread a salty crunch that made it taste richer than it had any right to be. Mothers mixed the cornmeal, eggs, milk, and bits of cracklin' together, pouring the batter into a hot pan that sizzled the moment it touched the surface. The smell of baking cornbread filled the house, warm and sweet, even before it was ready. Kids loved the crispy edges most, the way the cracklin' gave each bite a little extra weight. It was filling, high energy, perfect for nights when the cold tried to seep into the walls. Served alone or with greens, it worked as both meal and memory. Crackling cornbread tasted like thrift turned into pride, like winter hunger held back by skill and heart. Sweet potato hash was one of those winter meals that carried families through the longest, coldest evenings when the house felt drafty and the money was already gone. Sweet potatoes lasted for months if you stored them right, tucked into a cool corner where they held on, even when everything else spoiled. Mothers peeled them, chopped them into thick cubes, and tossed them into a skillet with onions sizzling in a little oil. The smell was deep and earthy, the kind of scent that settled low in the air and made kids drift into the kitchen to see if dinner was almost ready. As the potatoes softened and browned, the onions melted into them, giving every bite a sweetness mixed with a little sharpness that warmed you from the inside out. Kids loved scraping the crispy bits from the bottom of the pan, the ones that tasted smoky and rich like they had been cooked just for them. It was a full skillet meal that cost nearly nothing but felt like something made with intention and care. Sweet potato hash was a dish that held families steady during hard winters, reminding everyone that simple food could still be comforting, filling, and memorable. It was warmth you could taste, survival you could savor, and one more example of how Black households in the 1970s turned everyday ingredients into lifelines. Peanut butter biscuits were the kind of winter comfort food that made up for the nights when meat was impossible to afford and the pantry looked emptier than anyone wanted to say out loud. Peanut butter was cheap, full of protein, and stretched a long way, so mothers mixed it into biscuit dough to make something heavier, richer, and more filling than a regular biscuit could ever be. The dough came together quickly, soft and slightly sticky, and once it hit the oven, the whole house filled with a smell that felt like a blanket wrapped around your shoulders. Kids waited for them to come out hot and golden, hoping to be the first to split one open and watch the steam rise. Sometimes syrup went on top, sometimes jelly, sometimes just a pat of butter if there was any left. No matter how they were served, the biscuits were warm, thick, and comforting in a way that made you forget for a moment how tight things were. Each bite had that nutty flavor that stuck to the top of your mouth just long enough to make you smile. They were cheap, reliable, and exactly the kind of food that kept families going through long winters when the cold pressed in from every wall. Peanut butter biscuits tasted like care made visible. Pinto beans and ham hock were one of the most dependable winter meals a Black family could make in the 1970s, a pot that simmered slow and steady while the cold pressed against the windows. Pinto beans were cheap and came in big bags that could last for several meals, and a single ham hock turned them into something hearty and deeply flavored. Mothers soaked the beans overnight when they could, then dropped them into a large pot with onions, water, and the ham hock sitting right in the center like a small anchor holding everything together. As it simmered for hours, the ham hock released its salt and smoke, and the beans drank it in until the whole pot thickened into something that felt like warmth itself. Kids wandered in and out of the kitchen, asking if it was ready yet, even though they knew it never was until dinner time. When it finally came together, it filled bowls with a richness that did not match the price of the ingredients served with rice or cornbread. It stretched for days, and each day tasted deeper than the last. Pinto beans and ham hock were a winter promise that no one would go to bed hungry. Fried cornmeal mush was the kind of breakfast that turned leftovers into something special after a night of freezing temperatures and thin blankets. Cornmeal mush was simple, made by cooking cornmeal with water until it thickened into a heavy porridge, but the magic happened the next morning. Mothers sliced the chilled mush into thin rectangles, laid them in a hot skillet, and fried them until the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft. The sound of the mush hitting the pan was quiet but comforting, a soft sizzle that meant a warm breakfast was on the way. Kids loved the contrast in each bite, the crunch on the outside and the creamy middle inside. Sometimes syrup went over the top, sometimes powdered sugar, and sometimes nothing at all because the flavor was enough. It was cheap, filling, and warm. Everything a family needed before stepping out into the cold, fried cornmeal mush was a winter morning ritual that turned scraps into sustenance and taught kids that even the simplest food could be worth remembering. Okra and tomato winter stew was a humble pot that brought together two ingredients. Black families knew how to stretch through lean months. Canned tomatoes were cheap and lasted forever, and frozen okra kept well enough to make it into most winter meals. Mothers combined them with onions, seasoning, and sometimes a leftover bone or bit of smoked meat if the house had some. The stew bubbled slowly, thickening as the okra softened and released its juices, turning the tomatoes into a sauce that coated every spoonful. Kids sometimes teased each other about the texture of okra, but they still showed up with bowls in hand when the smell filled the house. It was warm, savory, and surprisingly filling, a dish that carried families through the days when fresh produce was impossible to afford. Served with rice or cornbread, the stew became a complete meal, one that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Okra and tomato stew was a winter companion, steady and dependable. Salt pork and cabbage soup was a meal built for hard weather and harder weeks, the kind that stretched calories when the fridge was nearly empty. Salt pork added just enough fat and flavor to turn cabbage and water into something that tasted like a real meal. Mothers chopped the cabbage, let it wilt in a pot with onions, then dropped in a small piece of salt pork that seasoned everything as it simmered. The broth turned savory and warm, filling the kitchen with a smell that made kids feel like dinner would be enough after all. Cabbage softened into silky ribbons that soaked up every bit of flavor, and no one ever complained about the simplicity because it tasted good and filled the stomach. It was cheap, reliable, and the kind of soup that made you forget for a moment how thin the grocery budget had become. Salt pork and cabbage soup tasted like winter resilience in a bowl. Homemade vegetable scrap broth was one of the quiet survival strategies families relied on, especially during deep winter when groceries had to stretch for as long as possible. Nothing was thrown away if it could give even a little flavor. Carrot ends, onion skins, celery tops, bones, and whatever else the house had went into a pot of water to simmer for hours. The scraps slowly released their flavor, turning the water into a warm, nourishing broth that could become the base for soups, rice, gravies, and stews throughout the week. Mothers knew how to coax every bit of goodness out of nothing, and this broth was proof of that skill. Kids might not have understood the magic behind it, but they felt the warmth in every meal it helped create. The broth was cheap, simple, and life-giving during the coldest months, a small act of care that stretched across days. It was a reminder that survival was not always about big meals, but about making the most of every scrap the kitchen offered. Sorghum syrup oatmeal was a winter breakfast that stuck with you, warming you from the inside out before school, or chores called you into the cold. Oats were inexpensive and dependable, and sorghum syrup added a deep, earthy sweetness that made the meal feel more special than it cost to make. Mothers cooked the oats slowly until they thickened, then drizzled the syrup over the top so it melted into the warm bowl. Kids stirred it in eagerly, watching the syrup swirl through the oats until the whole thing turned golden. Each bite was sweet, hearty, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that kept your stomach full well into the afternoon. It tasted like quiet mornings in a warm kitchen while frost gathered on the windows. Sorghum syrup oatmeal was a winter gift, simple but memorable. Butter beans with smoked turkey tails were a pot that made the entire house smell like the best kind of winter comfort. Turkey tails were cheap, often overlooked, but they released enough fat and smoke to transform butter beans into something rich and satisfying. Mothers simmered the beans slowly, letting the turkey tails soften and break apart as the pot cooked. The beans absorbed the flavor, turning creamy and thick. Kids knew the smell long before they heard the call for dinner, drifting toward the kitchen with bowls already in hand. The meal was hearty, filling, and stretched across multiple days when money needed to go further. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a winter staple. Butter beans with turkey tails tasted like thrift, turned into abundance. Catfish head stew was one of the most frugal winter meals in many southern and urban Black households, a dish that proved flavor did not depend on the expensive cuts. Fish heads were cheap, sometimes given away for almost nothing, but they carried enough richness to season an entire pot. Mothers simmered them with onions, tomatoes, and seasoning, letting the fish release its oils and flavor into the broth. As the stew cooked, the aroma grew strong and comforting, a signal that dinner would fill stomachs even if the budget could not. Kids sometimes looked at the fish heads with curiosity or caution, but once the stew was served, they cleaned their bowls without complaint. The meat around the cheeks and collars was tender, and the broth tasted deeply of the sea, even in landlocked neighborhoods. It was a winter staple for families who refused to let scarcity win. Catfish head stew was resourcefulness and resilience in one pot. Rice and gravy made from pan drippings was one of the most reliable winter meals mothers turned to when there was not enough food left in the house to make anything bigger. Every drop of flavor mattered in those days, so nothing from a pan was ever wasted. Once the meat was gone, she would take the browned bits left behind, the tiny pieces of onion or seasoning clinging stubbornly to the bottom, and add water or milk to coax out every bit of richness. Slowly, the drippings dissolved, turning the liquid into a thin but deeply flavored gravy that smelled like a full dinner even when it was only a fraction of one. The rice went on the stove next, cheap, filling, and dependable, the kind of food that made sure no one went to bed hungry. Kids watched the steam rise from the pot, knowing that the gravy would soak into the grains and turn the simplest bowl into something warm and comforting. This was winter cooking at its most honest, taking what you had and stretching it without apology. The meal did not pretend to be fancy, but it held families steady through nights when the cold crept through the walls and the fridge felt painfully empty. Rice and gravy tasted like thrift turned into care, like a mother's quiet determination to make something out of almost nothing. Stewed rutabagas and carrots were a winter staple built from vegetables that could survive long stretches in the pantry without spoiling. These root vegetables were cheap, often overlooked, but they carried a sweetness that only deepened when cooked low and slow. Mothers peeled them, chopped them into thick chunks, and let them simmer in a pot with onions, salt, pepper, and a little fat if the house had any left. As they cooked, the rutabagas softened into something buttery, while the carrots released their natural sugar into the broth. The smell was earthy and comforting, a reminder that winter food did not have to be complicated to be satisfying. Kids sometimes wrinkled their noses at rutabagas, but by the time the pot was ready, they were scooping out big spoonfuls without a second thought. The stew filled the stomach in a steady, grounding way, offering warmth that lasted long after the bowl was empty. Served alone or with cornbread, it could stretch into multiple meals, each one tasting richer than the last. Stewed rutabagas and carrots were a reminder that survival did not always look glamorous, but it always tasted like perseverance and care. Oxtail soup, back when oxtails were still affordable, was one of the richest winter meals a family could make without spending much at all. Before the cut became expensive, it was something butchers practically gave away, and mothers knew exactly how to turn it into a pot of gold. She browned the oxtails first, letting the fat render and the bones darken in the pot. Then came water, onions, seasoning, and whatever vegetables the house could spare. The pot simmered for hours, filling the kitchen with a smell so deep and savory it seemed impossible that the meal had cost so little. As the soup cooked, the gelatin from the bones melted into the broth, giving it a thickness that warmed the body and soothed the spirit. Kids waited for the moment when the meat fell off the bone with barely any effort, soft and tender from the long, slow heat. The soup stretched across days, tasting better each time it was reheated. It was rich, nourishing, and comforting, the kind of food that helped families push through the coldest months with something warm in their bellies. Oxtail soup was winter elegance built from scraps. Chitterlings and potatoes were the kind of winter meal that required time, patience, and a strong will. But for many families, it was one of the few affordable ways to put something hearty on the table. Chitterlings were cheap, and potatoes were even cheaper, so mothers used both to build a dish that filled the house with warmth during long cleaning days. The cleaning of the chitterlings was a ritual in itself, one that older kids knew well and younger kids watched with curiosity. Once cleaned, the chitterlings simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until they softened and soaked up every bit of flavor potatoes went in next, breaking down slowly and adding bulk to the dish. The aroma was strong, earthy, unmistakable, a scent that signaled both work and comfort. Kids may have hesitated at first, but by dinner time they were filling their plates gratefully. The meal was dense, warming, and full of calories needed for the coldest days. Chitterlings and potatoes were winter survival at its most traditional. Stewed chicken gizzards were one of those meals that reminded everyone just how far a single, inexpensive ingredient could be stretched when times were hard. Gizzards were cheap, often sold in small tubs for barely any money, but they became tender and flavorful when cooked long enough. Mothers browned them first, letting the edges sear, then covered them in water with onions and garlic. As the pot simmered for hours, the gizzards softened into something surprisingly rich, their broth turning thick and savory. Kids learned to love the chewy texture because it came wrapped in the kind of gravy that begged to be poured over rice or mashed potatoes. The meal was warm, affordable, and filling, exactly what families depended on during winter weeks when money was thin and the cold was relentless. Stewed chicken gizzards were proof that cheap food could still taste like love. Winter greens and beans over rice was a complete meal built from the most dependable ingredients in a Black household pantry. Collards or turnip greens lasted through the cold, and dried beans stretched across days with hardly any cost. Mothers simmered the greens until they were tender, adding beans and seasoning to make the pot richer and more filling. The dish was poured over rice, transforming a handful of simple ingredients into something hearty enough to keep everyone full through the long winter evening. The flavors were deep, earthy, and comforting, the kind of warmth that stuck with you long after the bowl was empty. Kids ate it eagerly because it tasted good, but also because it felt steady and familiar. Winter greens and beans over rice were survival disguised as comfort. Sweet potato cornbread was the dense, soft, deeply warming bread that made winter dinners feel fuller than they really were. Sweet potatoes were cheap and lasted months, and when mashed into cornbread batter, they added moisture and natural sweetness that made every slice feel like a small treat. Mothers baked it in heavy pans that came out of the oven sizzling around the edges. The smell filled the whole house, rich and inviting, cutting through the cold like a promise. Kids loved how thick and tender it was, especially with a smear of butter if the family had any left. They would tear it apart with their hands, watching the steam curl upward like the bread itself was exhaling warmth into the room. It paired well with whatever else was on the table, from beans to greens to nothing more than a cup of sweet tea, because its strength came from how it made every meal feel larger. Sweet potato cornbread was cheap to make but tasted like generosity, like a quiet attempt to make winter feel a little kinder than it was. Canned salmon croquettes were one of the most dependable winter meals because canned fish was affordable and easy to store. Mothers mixed the salmon with onions, egg, cornmeal, and seasoning, forming patties that hit the hot skillet with a satisfying sizzle. The croquettes browned beautifully, crisp on the outside and soft inside, carrying just enough fish flavor to feel special without costing much at all. Kids waited eagerly for them, especially when served with rice or bread on the side. The sound of the croquettes frying was almost as comforting as the smell, a steady reminder that dinner was close and that warmth would soon spread across the table. Sometimes mothers added leftover vegetables or herbs to stretch the mixture even further, turning one can into a feast that lasted the whole evening. It was a meal that tasted far richer than its price suggested, a reminder that skill mattered just as much as ingredients. Salmon croquettes were winter comfort mastered in a pan, a testament to cooking that found joy inside limitation. Navy bean and onion soup was one of the simplest winter pots, but it carried a depth that surprised anyone who underestimated it. Navy beans were cheap and filling, and onions transformed with slow cooking until they melted into the broth. Mothers let the pot simmer all afternoon, letting the house fill with a warm, steady smell that made the cold feel far away. Kids dipped cornbread or saltines into the soup, listening to the wind outside and feeling grateful for something hot. The longer it simmered, the creamier the beans became, turning the broth into something silky and soothing. Even the sound of the bubbling pot felt comforting, like the kitchen itself was working hard to keep everyone safe. Leftovers tasted even better the next day, thickened and seasoned by time. Navy bean and onion soup was not glamorous, but it was kind, and sometimes kindness was all a family needed to push through the hardest stretch of winter. Homemade lard biscuits with syrup were winter survivals stacked on a plate, offering warmth, calories, and comfort when money was too tight for anything else. Lard made the biscuits rich and tender, the kind of bread that melted when eaten hot. Mothers whipped the dough together quickly, rolling it out and cutting biscuits that rose beautifully in the oven. Kids waited beside the table with plates ready, knowing syrup would soon be poured over the top, soaking into every warm layer. The moment the syrup touched the biscuit, it disappeared into the flaky folds, leaving behind a glossy sweetness that tasted like a reward for making it through another cold day. Even one biscuit could keep a child full for hours, its richness lingering long after breakfast or dinner had passed. For many families, this simple meal replaced meat, dessert, and everything in between. The meal was simple, sweet, and filling, exactly what winter demanded. Homemade lard biscuits with syrup tasted like love on the leanest days, a reminder that comfort did not always need to be complicated to matter. Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful. Collard green sandwiches were the definition of thrift turned into comfort. Cooked low with fatback or smoked turkey, the greens soaked up flavor until every leaf was silky and seasoned deep. When money ran low or bread was scarce, those greens found their way between leftover biscuits or cornbread slices. Steam rose as you bit in, a mix of salt, spice, and love. It was not fancy, but it was filling and full of meaning. Families who could not afford meat still tasted richness in every bite. The juice, called Potlikker, dripped down fingers and onto plates, too precious to waste. Every mouthful carried generations of resourcefulness, the quiet art of making do and making good. Collard green sandwiches were not about excess. They were about endurance, flavor born from necessity, and the memory of hands that turned hunger into something worth remembering. Some added a slice of onion or a smear of hot sauce, making every sandwich their own. Others packed them for field work, the warmth holding steady long after morning. The smell alone spoke of family kitchens where stories simmered as slow as the greens themselves. Collard green sandwiches were proof that love, not wealth, made a meal worth having. Goosefoot seed meal offered vital nourishment when cultivated grains were scarce or too costly. Goosefoot, also known as lamb's quarters, grew abundantly along field edges and yielded tiny seeds rich in protein and minerals. Enslaved harvesters shook the plants over cloths to collect the seeds, then winnowed and ground them into a fine flour. This flour could be cooked into hot cereal, mixed with cornmeal for bread, or used to thicken stews, providing a surprisingly hearty alternative to purchased grain. The practice drew on both African and indigenous traditions of using wild seeds as staple foods. Even after emancipation, rural families in parts of the Midwest and Appalachia continued to gather goosefoot seeds for their high nutritional value. Modern interest in quinoa, which is a close relative, echoes this old wisdom. Goosefoot seed meal stands as a reminder that careful attention to the landscape and patient handwork could turn what many considered weeds into a dependable source of strength and nourishment that kept families fed through the hardest seasons. Okra gumbo with fresh crab told the story of low-country waters and West African roots in every bowl. Thickened by the natural mucilage of okra and deepened with a slow-simmered stock, the stew held blue crab, onions, bell peppers, and fragrant spices that reflected both coastal bounty and ancestral memory. Fishermen brought the catch of the day to markets where cooks bargained for the sweetest crab meat, while home gardeners plucked tender okra pods from vines that thrived in humid summers. The gumbo pot became a gathering place where family and neighbors stood around sharing stories as the aroma of seafood and spice filled the air. Served over rice, each spoonful carried the taste of tides, soil, and a heritage that stretched back across the Atlantic. In modern times, many turned to faster recipes and frozen ingredients, losing the patient layering of flavor that once defined this dish. Yet for those who remember, nothing matches the soulful depth of a true okra gumbo made with freshly caught crab. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Potted meat and crackers were the kind of lunch that kept you moving when times were lean. A small tin held a salty, spreadable mixture that could be stretched across stacks of crackers or slices of bread. It was cheap, easy to carry, and filled more bellies than it had any right to. In lunch pails and brown paper bags, it was a steady companion to long days at the mill, in the fields, or on the road. Kids learned to love its sharp, smoky taste, mixed with mustard or relish when there was something extra to spare. It was not fancy, but it was faithful. In every bite was a story of making something from nearly nothing, of dignity and survival. Potted meat and crackers proved that lunch did not need luxury to carry pride. It only needed a little salt, a little grit, and a lot of heart. Some mixed it with chopped onions to make it stretch. Others used it to fill sandwiches that stayed soft until noon. The metallic pop of the tin opening was as familiar as the sound of morning rain, a promise that there would be food that day. It was humble, yes, but it never failed to do its job. Potted meat and crackers were lunch at its simplest and most sincere. Cypress berry relish brought a sharp tang to otherwise plain meals by using the small, resin-scented berries of native cypress trees. Gatherers collected the ripe berries carefully, then simmered them with a little water and a drizzle of molasses when available, creating a dark, aromatic relish with a unique balance of sweet and bitter flavors. This condiment enlivened cornbread, stewed greens, or smoked fish, adding variety to a diet that often lacked spices. The recipe reflected African traditions of turning wild fruits into bold sauces, and also borrowed techniques from indigenous peoples who valued cypress for its medicinal properties. Though seldom made today, the memory of cypress berry relish lingers in regional stories of swamp foraging and resourceful cooking. It highlights how a deep understanding of the local ecosystem allowed people to transform unexpected ingredients into something flavorful and sustaining. Cypress berry relish stands as a tribute to both culinary creativity and the enduring connection between survival foods and the natural abundance of the southern wetlands. Tell us which survival food amazed you most, like this video, and subscribe to keep these powerful food traditions alive. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillets, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was one of the purest meals ever made. A leftover square of cornbread was crumbled into a bowl and covered with cold buttermilk until it soaked through. Eaten with a spoon, it was both breakfast and lunch for many, a cool meal on a hot afternoon or a quick one before a long day's work. It was simple food, but it filled you up and refreshed your spirit. The tang of buttermilk mixed with the sweetness of cornmeal, creating a balance that never needed fixing. Elders swore it kept them strong, a kind of rural nourishment that required no stove, no fuss, just honesty. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was humility made beautiful, a reminder that the best meals often came from what was already there. The sound of the cornbread crumbling and the first splash of buttermilk was comfort itself. It was a farmer's lunch, a grandmother's wisdom. a child's first taste of simplicity done right. Some added a sprinkle of sugar or black pepper for extra bite, but it never needed help to shine. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was proof that real satisfaction came from patience, thrift, and the flavor of home. Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the southern landscape's hidden gifts. If one of these meals warmed your memory, drop your favorite below, hit like, and subscribe for more.